Welcome to a Passamaquoddy podcast. Today, we're speaking with Dr. Melanie Jeffrey, postdoctoral fellow at the Wabakanas Bryce Institute for Indigenous Health at the University of Toronto. Welcome, Dr. Jeffrey.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Your area of study is Indigenous health. We're all human beings. How does that differ from ordinary person health? What are the parameters there?
Well, all of our health are affected by lots of things. We are all human beings, but we're all affected by different things. Some people refer to these as social determinants of health. So yes, you're going to have different things in your, whether you have adequate access to nutrition, whether there is a good school nearby, whether you have support for your studies, whether you have adequate housing. A lot of these things are going to affect your health from a very young age. We're starting to see some what I find very interesting research that is showing biological mechanisms of intergenerational trauma. So a lot of people don't understand what intergenerational trauma means. And it's not just behavioral. There is definitely something that is learned from people and the parenting skills that can be lost when successive generations are taken away from their families. But we're seeing now in cardiac cells in the heart and in different brain cells, microglia specifically, that if there's been an adverse event in someone's childhood or during their pregnancy, then their next baby can be born with a propensity to have inflammatory diseases. That includes an enormous array of things, anything from cancer to diabetes to heart disease. But it predisposes you to those things. So the notion, there was a notion a long time ago of something called the Thrifty gene hypothesis. And that was Western researchers, predominantly white male Western researchers, looking at, Indigenous people must have different metabolism than us because of their diet historically. Well, certainly part of that is true. But to look at diabetes propensity in terms of obesity and genetics, when you don't account for poverty, racism, and colonization, never mind living in a remote or rural community, all of those things together play a big role in who we are and how healthy we are and can be.
Speaking of trauma, we have a very sorry history of trauma involving the residential schools in this country. When you look at it in your terms, that's a huge problem then. Huge.
Absolutely. Yeah, those kids were terrorized. And then they learned through cycles and generations that this was something they also would inflict on each other through generations. So breaking the cycle, you hear that phrase a lot of the time. Something else that people don't talk about as much, but I really hope comes on the agenda soon, is another horrific part of our past, Indian hospitals. Have you heard that phrase before?
Yes, I'm from Edmonton, the Charles Council.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this was segregated healthcare. People were not allowed to leave.
And in the case of Alberta, flown in from the north, in many cases.
Because there were no
there was nothing,
there.
Yeah.
Right, but it was also under sort of the auspices of it being a tuberculosis center.
Yes,
but people were experimented on, coerced sterilization. There were or absolutely incredibly unethical things happened. So in terms of being willing to seek Western health care, there's a lot of trust that needs to be overcome.
Indeed.
So often for people, they have so much difficulty trusting Western health care through the generations of their families' experiences. Add on top of that colonization, racism, and their first point of contact with the healthcare system is usually the emergency room. And often people strategize before they go to the hospital because they know that they're going to be up against those things. And I've seen that. I've witnessed it personally many times.
Quite a long time ago at CBC Radio, I interviewed a woman, an Inuit woman, who was born on the ice, and while her family was hunting, and a few years later ended up in a residential school in Inuvik, where the diet was so radically different and inadequate for her, I think.
Oh yeah, those children all suffered from malnutrition.
Yes.
They weren't given enough to eat, the schools weren't funded adequately, never mind that they didn't teach them much of anything other than to be a servant class. Like, they were taught to peel potatoes and things like that. So they definitely did not get enough to eat. And you can imagine what that does to someone over a lifetime as well.
They couldn't have gotten enough calories, just for starters, because their diet was heavy on fish and animals, right? And here they are eating potatoes and tinned peas or something.
Most of it was actually, they got a slice of bread and jam. That was like as good as it got for a lot of them.
Yeah.
Or else they'd have porridge that was rancid, or something would have worms in it. Like that. This is it's just so shocking now for me to think about looking back. And the last residential school closed in 1996.
Really? Where was that?
Yes. I'm not sure. I'd need to check, but they were open for quite some time.
Quite some time. Yeah, I had no idea.
And when they were created, there was an expression that I believe John A. Macdonald used: "Kill the Indian to save the man." And they were trying to acculturate people. They were trying to destroy their culture, and that's now we call that genocide.
Yeah. But when I think of that story, I can you can see the physical effects so far down the line in those communities. When I think of my former friends' experience, and the diabetes, but so many other diseases must have been.
Right. Well, if you think about that, childhood trauma, including things like malnutrition. If you're malnourished, you can't have a healthy baby.
No.
As healthy a baby. So that's pretty straightforward. But if you're not getting the nutrients that you need, if you like traditional foods, or the Inuit refer to them often as country foods, are so nutrient dense. They're so healthy. They're very high in fiber. They really make a traditional
omega-3s and all that stuff.
The omega-3s they're incredibly healthy. But if you take people out of that environment and make them go to school during the school year, they can't learn those skills, right? So, and in terms of learning how to cook and prepare that food, that's something people are taking back now. That's something that people are teaching each other and sharing with each other.
Probably the women.
The women, but also we're starting to get some fantastic restaurants now in Toronto that serve game and some traditional foods.
I lived in Vancouver for some time, and there was a wonderful, I'm not sure which tribe, but the great salmon and oily fish, which was wonderful. Yeah.
And the trout here plays a very similar role in the diet. Very,
trout is
very
often
high end.
Nicer than salmon.
Sometimes, yeah. But then we've got issues like, the traditional foods being poisoned. So grassy narrows is an example there. Like the trout, which is such an important part of diet, and especially for a healthy pregnancy, that's one of the foods that is the most contaminated. But it was also one of the foods that was the most relied on in terms of nutrition for the area.
Was it a factor that that the heavy metals and whatever were sort of picked up by the oily nature of the flesh of the fish or something?
No, how it works is that it's called something called bioaccumulation. So a trout is very high up on the feeding chain, right?
Right.
So there's these little microbes at the bottom, and they pick up mercury.
Yeah.
And they methylate it. And what that means is they make it edible for
Yeah.
other things.
Yeah.
It turns it into an organic kind of mercury. If you tried to swallow plain mercury, it would
Yeah, that would
slide
be-
through you.
yeah.
But so it goes up and up the food chain, and it accumulates as things eat more and more of it, but then it gets magnified too. So we have bioaccumulation over the course of an animal's life, and then over the course of the food chain, we have biomagnification. So something, by the time you reach something like a pickerel or a trout, a top predator who's relatively long-lived, the mercury doesn't leave you once you've got it. It's stuck there. They can end up containing massive amounts of different chemicals. And it's the same, like turtles at Passamaquoddy are a very similar example.
Well, these problems are just, they're monumental, they're astronomical.
Mm-hmm.
How do you begin writing the situation?
I always, often because I work with so many awesome and inspiring young people, so that often they feel overwhelmed by this. And it's now developed a term in popular culture called eco-anxiety. And I say to them, if you do nothing, nothing will change. But if you act, if we all act, things can change. I will not give up. I know all of these things, and I have hope.
And where do you begin? What does each individual have to take on?
I think when you're working in Indigenous health, there is you need to be an activist. In many respects, your work is is activism.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you're really pushing for a kind of change in a way that other medical research may not be. So, because Indigenous health has been so compromised by colonization, right? First of all, let people make their own decisions. You need to educate healthcare workers, all of them, on how to be culturally safe or keep their environment where they practice culturally safe. And I was saying earlier, cultural competency and cultural awareness are learning about someone's culture. Cultural safety is being very aware and self-reflective about the power relationships between you and the person you're working with. Maybe you don't even know they're there, but you need to be informed by history. You need to have an understanding of these things. And so often that is what we'll share with people we're working with. This is the reason that people don't tend to self-identify or participate in studies. There's a lot of broken trust there. They don't want to self-identify because filling out surveys and participating in studies has been very harmful in the past, right? With no benefit for individuals and communities. Often people lie to, it was awful. The ethics of things have really changed a great deal, but there are a lot of academics who have a long way to go catching up. There are some people that I really respect in terms of their scientific work, but I can't work with them anymore and they're interested in working in Indigenous health issues, and they don't get it. They're not willing to put in the time and the effort and they're not willing to let the communities direct research agendas. It takes longer. Everything takes longer. Ethics review take longer. The studies take longer because you're working collaboratively with people.
And I assume geographical areas are somewhat larger in many ways. You're moving in a widely scattered community sometimes.
Sometimes, but in Ontario, a lot of people aren't aware of this. In Ontario, over 80% of the Indigenous population lives in rural or urban areas, right? Mm-hmm. There's sort of a perception that most people live on reservations and live in remote areas, and that's simply not the case. There are a lot of people who have to go somewhere else to look for work, mm-hmm. who have to go somewhere else to look for school, who have to go somewhere else to look for opportunity and for something like decent housing. If you haven't seen some of the housing options that are available on different reserves, you should probably look and check it out. There's a fantastic video produced by teenagers in Grassy Narrows, and somebody went up and helped them produce their own music video of a song they wrote and performed, and it's called Feels Like Home to Me. They don't want to leave Grassy Narrows.
Well, that's the assumption I think that the wider community may used to take, that Indigenous people want to come here and want to live in a big city and you know, be someone else other than they are.
But you can be an urban person and be an Indigenous person.
Oh, no,
anything
indeed,
else is,
but
you know.
I think that generally, you know, the white majority had no idea.
Well, I find generally the white majority has no idea what's going on north of Vaughan, but it's in Northern Ontario is enormous. Just
enormous. Try going through it on the train.
Nation is like the size of France. Yeah. Then you look on the Northwest Lynn on the other side, that one's the size of Germany. These are enormous, enormous areas. But what a lot of people in cities don't see is the resource extraction that goes on there. They don't see what is happening that is polluting things. They don't see the clear cutting of forests. They don't see the spraying of the Roundup, the pesticide. So and that creates these huge, you know, fuel loads because it doesn't allow the alders and poplars, other hardwood trees to grow around these stands of pine that they plant.
I didn't know that.
So that's like a firewall, having that there, and that grows naturally, right? After, if there were a fire to go through there, those plants would be the first ones up. But they'll kill them with the Roundup so they can stuff more of those trees in there and meet their quotas. That's been a big problem. First of all, it's poisoned. Like I've been with elders who have talked about it poisoning the fish in the river. A few days later, the whole ecosystem changing, not knowing what's happening, not knowing what's safe to eat, not knowing how they can practice their traditional ways. And a lot of people still do if they live in those more rural, more remote communities. But expecting people to be like that is, I think, it's racist. You're making assumptions about people based on a notion, right?
Hugely, yeah. Well, when you think in these, you know, terrible days under the person now occupying the White House, environmental regulations have been going out the window on a daily basis, and I fear as Canadians that sets a tone, or, you know, if it's okay to do there, it's okay to do up here, or something like that. Do you think about that?
Yes, I do, and it breaks my heart. Frankly, I see a lot of hope in youth and what they are saying, and how much people who are not even old enough to vote are doing and saying and reclaiming their future. And I hope that enough people vote to have an impact here. But we're working against some very powerful lobby groups with a lot of money. That doesn't mean we can't win. Now, the US, unfortunately, has such a large footprint on the environment. Canada, we have this impression that we're not as bad, which is simply not true. Our resource extraction economy is enormously bad for the environment. Oh, we can get more natural gas out now. We'll just frack. That fracking technology, another good thing to look up. Disgusting, revolting what it does, how much water it uses, the chemicals that are used, just to look in a hole. And they say that this is a less intensive way of checking for things. And the Anthropocene, did you see that exhibit?
Yes.
So
yes.
What's the artist's name? I can't remember right now. The photographer.
It's just popped right out of my head.
Yeah, absolutely fabulous.
Yeah.
But in terms of really seeing what humans' impacts on the environment can be, and most of that is affected Indigenous people, right? abandoned mines. There are, I think, over 1,000 abandoned mines in Canada. Nobody's cleaning them up, right? And a lot of them are on Indigenous land. They don't have subsurface rights.
Well, on that, on that note, you said you are putting your faith in young people.
Yeah.
Good luck to you and them.
Well, they inspire me. They do. That's one of the wonderful things about being at teaching courses at a university. And there's some mature students who are older than me, and then there's a lot of students who are much younger than me. And so it keeps you young in a way, working with young people, but I do have a lot of hope for them. And I keep seeing these incredibly inspiring, 8-year-olds doing amazing things, There is hope, but we need to act.
On that note, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to a Passamaquoddy podcast. Join in the conversation. You can call the main office at area code 506-466-2216. The website is www.kanaskambuk.com. That's KONASKAMKUK.com. Our Facebook address is at Passamaquoddy at Skutik Office, Instagram at Passamaquoddy Office, and the Twitter at Skukitat, SKUTIKAT.